phone calls constantly, Viv's going to get shot tonight.
Newcastle, December 31st, 1993. The city's streets pulsed with anticipation. A wild carnival of sound and light as thousands prepared to welcome the new year. Neon signs flickered above pubs and nightclubs. Laughter spilled out into the cold night air, and fireworks were already crackling against the inky sky. In the heart of this chaos, one man walked with the confidence of someone who believed he owned the streets. His name was Viv Graham. At 6'3", broad-shouldered and iron-jawed, Viv was impossible to miss. In Newcastle, he was both feared and admired. To some, he was a ruthless enforcer, the Hardman who controlled protection rackets across the city's nightlife. To others, he was the unofficial guardian of order in a scene that could spiral into violence without him. He collected respect the way others collected debts, and his reputation preceded him wherever he went. That night, as the clock crept toward midnight, Viv exited a pub in Wallsend. The cold winter air hit his face, but it was nothing compared to the sudden chill of paranoia that sometimes haunted men like him. Enemies were everywhere, rival gangs, spurned associates, men who had once paid him but now plotted his downfall. Still, Viv carried himself with the swagger of a man convinced he was untouchable. Then it happened. The sharp crack of gunfire shattered the festive night. 3 bullets tore through the silence, cutting down Newcastle's Hardman in the street. Witnesses screamed. Some froze in shock, while others ran for cover. The shooter disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the roar of fireworks and the chaos of celebration. Viv Graham lay bleeding on the pavement, the life draining from one of Tyneside's most notorious figures. Within minutes, his fate was sealed. The man who had ruled the doors of Newcastle's nightclubs, who had built an empire on fear and loyalty, was dead at just 34 years old. The murder sent shockwaves through the city. In a world where violence was common currency, this assassination stood out, brazen, calculated, and chillingly unsolved. Police scrambled for leads, rivals whispered in pubs, and the legend of Viv Graham grew in the telling. This is the story of Newcastle's Hardman, assassinated on New Year's Eve, a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. Viv Graham's assassination was not just another gangland killing. It was a statement, a message etched in gunfire on one of the most symbolic nights of the year. New Year's Eve was meant to be a time of renewal, of celebration. But in 1993, it became forever marked in Newcastle's memory by the violent end of a man who had embodied the city's underworld. Graham had risen to power as the undisputed door boss of Newcastle's booming nightclub scene. From Whitley Bay to the city center, his men controlled who entered, who paid, and who stayed safe. For club owners and bar managers, protection money was a necessary cost of doing business. For Viv, it was the backbone of his empire. He operated in a climate of intimidation, but also carried a strange charisma. Many of his doormen and associates spoke of him with loyalty and admiration. Others described him as brutal, quick to use violence to enforce his rule. On the night of his murder, he had gone out as usual, blending his role as both a feared enforcer and a man about town. But as he stepped into the cold night air, his life ended in seconds. No one was ever convicted of the crime. Theories swirled, rival gangs seeking revenge, disgruntled former associates, or even personal vendettas. For the police, his killing presented a dilemma. They were well aware of Graham's operations, but the climate of fear and silence that surrounded Newcastle's underworld made gathering evidence nearly impossible. Witnesses vanished into the shadows, stories conflicted, and rumors traveled faster than facts. Yet, the murder became more than a police file. It became folklore. Newspapers painted Viv as both villain and victim, the Hardman who could not escape the violent world he had built. Even decades later, his assassination remains one of the Northeast's most enduring mysteries, still whispered about in pubs and clubs across Tyneside. This is not just the story of one man's downfall. It is the story of a city's underworld, where loyalty and betrayal, fear and respect, lived side by side, and where justice never came. Viv Graham was born in 1959 in Newcastle upon Tyne, a city with a proud industrial heritage, but also a deep undercurrent of working-class toughness. The shipyards and coal mines shaped generations of hardmen, and Viv was no exception. From an early age, he was drawn into the rough-and-tumble environment of Tyneside streets, where fists often spoke louder than words. Tall, broad, and naturally intimidating, Viv had the physique and presence that set him apart. In his youth, he gravitated toward boxing and bodybuilding, developing a reputation as someone you didn't want to cross. Friends from his early days described him as charismatic, capable of drawing people to him with an easy smile. But beneath that charm lay a temper that could ignite with dangerous speed. By the 1980s, Newcastle's nightlife was booming, fueled by cheap alcohol, an emerging drug scene, and an appetite for late-night revelry. But with the money came chaos. Clubs were magnets for fights, drugs, and territorial disputes. Into this volatile arena stepped Viv Graham. He became a doorman first, then an enforcer, and eventually the man who controlled access to many of Newcastle's busiest night spots. The system was simple. Clubs paid for protection, and Viv's men provided muscle at the doors. They kept troublemakers out, ensured rival gangs didn't cause havoc, and projected an aura of authority that deterred violence. But beneath this order was a darker reality. Anyone who refused to pay quickly learned that Viv's reputation for violence was no bluff. Windows smashed, cars burned, and beatings delivered in dark alleys reminded business owners who truly ran the streets. Still, Viv wasn't seen purely as a thug. Many respected him for keeping the club safe, for handling disputes before they spiraled out of control. His mix of brutality and orderliness made him both feared and oddly admired. Some even considered him a local celebrity. His name whispered with awe in bars where his influence was felt. Surrounding him was a circle of loyal lieutenants, doormen, enforcers, and friends who shared in the profits and risks of his empire. But loyalty in the criminal underworld is always fragile. Rivals eyed his power hungrily, while resentful former allies waited for a chance to strike back. Newcastle's underworld was never static. Alliances shifted like tides, and every Hardman knew his reign could be temporary. What made Viv stand out was not only his physical dominance, but also his sheer visibility. He didn't hide in shadows. He strutted through the very clubs he controlled, drank with patrons, and lived like a king in the kingdom he built. That visibility brought admiration, but it also painted a target on his back. As the 1990s approached, tensions mounted. Rival groups grew bolder, and the stakes of the nightclub economy increased with the rise of drugs like ecstasy. Viv's empire was lucrative, but so were the grudges piling up against him. And somewhere among his friends, rivals, and enemies, the seeds of his downfall were already being sown. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Viv Graham's grip on Newcastle's nightlife was unmistakable. The door scene, as locals called it, was more than just a business of placing big men at club entrances. It was an entire economy built on control, intimidation, and the promise of security in a world where violence could erupt in seconds. Viv sat at the very top of this hierarchy, orchestrating operations that stretched across Tyneside. His method was deceptively straightforward. Club and bar owners were presented with a choice: pay for protection or face the consequences of refusing. For those who cooperated, Viv's men became a shield against troublemakers and rival gangs. For those who resisted, reminders came quickly: windows smashed in the dead of night, cars torched, or sudden bursts of chaos outside their premises. Few needed more than one lesson. Within a few years, most of Newcastle's nightlife economy fell under his watchful eye. Viv's network wasn't small. He commanded dozens of doormen, many of them former boxers, bodybuilders, or men with reputations forged in street fights. Their loyalty was purchased not only with money, but with the aura of power that came with working under Graham's banner. Being one of Viv's lads carried weight. It meant status, protection, and a share in the lucrative cash streams that flowed from nightclub doors. But the operations went deeper than brawn. The 1990s were the era of ecstasy, cocaine, and amphetamines flooding Britain's clubs. Where there were drugs, there was money, serious money. And though Viv was never conclusively tied to large-scale trafficking, his control of the doors gave him enormous influence over who sold inside. Dealers knew better than to operate without his blessing. Rumors suggested he taxed them, allowed only chosen networks to function, and skimmed off the profits for law enforcement. This blurred the line between security and organized crime. Violence remained the backbone of Viv's reputation. Tales spread of men dragged out of clubs and beaten senseless for crossing him, of rivals humiliated in public to send a message. Yet alongside this brutality was a strange sort of discipline. Unlike some gangs who allowed reckless chaos, Viv seemed to impose a code. Trouble that threatened his revenue was dealt with swiftly, but random violence was discouraged. To him, the clubs had to keep thriving. Too much disorder meant lost profits. Still, This iron-fisted order created enemies. Rival Hardman wanted their share of the door trade. Others bristled under Viv's dominance, waiting for a moment to strike back. Newcastle was not a city short on tough men, and Graham's rise made him a lightning rod for grudges, jealousies, and vendettas. By 1993, Viv's empire looked solid. He was feared on the streets, respected in the clubs, and untouchable in the eyes of many. But beneath the surface, resentment brewed. In the underworld, the higher a man climbs, the more dangerous the fall. Viv Graham had made himself indispensable, and in doing so, he had also made himself a target. For years, Northumbria police had kept Viv Graham's name in their files. His reputation as Newcastle's door boss was no secret. Officers knew he controlled the city's nightclub security, and they were well aware of the violence that followed in his wake. Yet pinning anything concrete on him proved nearly impossible. The very system that made Viv powerful also made him difficult to touch. Witnesses were reluctant to speak, some out of loyalty, most out of fear. Club owners who paid his men rarely complained. After all, business was booming, and trouble was kept at bay. Even when violence flared, victims hesitated to testify, knowing the price of crossing a man like Viv. In the streets, silence was its own kind of law. Still, police pressure was never far away. The early 1990s saw a national crackdown on organized crime, and Newcastle's door wars were drawing unwanted attention. Reports of beatings, threats, and intimidation trickled in, enough to make Viv a priority target. Specialized units began to monitor his movements, hoping to connect him to drug distribution or racketeering, but surveillance produced little more than shadows. He was careful, rarely handling money directly, and he surrounded himself with men willing to take the risks in his place. There were whispers, too, of corruption and complicity. Some locals believed that Viv's influence extended so deep that even parts of the establishment turned a blind eye. Whether true or not, the perception added to his aura of invincibility. To many on Tyneside, Viv wasn't just feared, he was untouchable. Yet within law enforcement, a sense of inevitability grew. Officers understood that men like Graham rarely retired quietly. His violence, his dominance, and his enemies meant that sooner or later, his story would end badly. The challenge for police was not whether his downfall would come, but whether it would come at their hands or through the hands of rivals. By the end of 1993, the answer was clear. On New Year's Eve, when bullets struck him down outside a pub in Wallsend, police rushed to the scene, not to arrest him, but to record his murder. The man they had watched for years, the one they could never quite bring down, had been silenced by someone else. And in that moment, a new challenge began, finding out who had dared to kill Newcastle's most notorious Hardman. New Year's Eve, 1993, was supposed to be another night of dominance for Viv Graham. He had spent the evening drinking with friends, moving through Newcastle's pubs and clubs, with the swagger of a man who believed he was still untouchable. The atmosphere was electric, music blasting, glasses clinking, and fireworks already warming the sky in anticipation of midnight. But beneath the celebration, tension brewed. For Viv, enemies were never far behind. Shortly after leaving a pub in Wallsend, Graham walked toward his car. It was just before midnight when the night split open with violence. A figure emerged from the shadows, a handgun raised. In an instant, 3 shots rang out, echoing louder than the fireworks. The first struck Viv in the body, the second in the chest, and the third tore into his leg. He collapsed to the pavement, stunned and bleeding, while the shooter fled into the winter night. The scene was chaos. Partygoers screamed and scattered, some frozen in disbelief, others too terrified to intervene. The sounds of celebration mixed grotesquely with the gasps of a dying man. Within minutes, police and paramedics arrived, but the damage was fatal. Viv Graham, Newcastle's Hardman, was pronounced dead at 34 years old. For the underworld, the murder was seismic. Graham's reign had ended not with a police raid or a courtroom sentence, but with the cold efficiency of a contract-style hit. The man who had ruled the doors of Newcastle's nightlife was gone in a matter of seconds. Theories multiplied instantly. Some said it was revenge from a rival crew, tired of living in his shadow. Others whispered about disgruntled former allies who had finally turned. There were even suggestions of personal feuds unrelated to business, old grudges that had simmered too long. The gunman was never caught, and the silence of the streets ensured the mystery only deepened. The turning point of this story was not just Viv's death, it was the vacuum it created. His assassination shattered the fragile balance of power in Newcastle. With Graham gone, new contenders rushed to claim the throne, igniting fresh violence in the very clubs he once controlled. And for the police, the case became less about one man's murder and more about the unraveling of an entire criminal ecosystem. In the immediate aftermath of Viv Graham's murder, Newcastle was gripped by shock and fear. A man who had seemed invincible, gunned down on the most public of nights, left both his allies and rivals rattled. Police launched one of the largest manhunts Tyneside had seen, determined to bring the killer or killers to justice. But unlike the cinematic raids that had toppled other gangsters, this case unfolded in frustration, false leads, and dead ends. Detectives targeted Graham's known rivals first. Doors were kicked in across Newcastle, homes searched, and suspected Hardman dragged in for questioning. Raids on pubs and clubs yielded weapons, drugs, and plenty of intimidation, but no solid evidence tying anyone to the assassination. Every suspect had an alibi, every lead dissolved into rumor. The city's underworld, long accustomed to the code of silence, closed ranks tighter than ever. Some names emerged again and again in whispers, rival enforcers with grudges, men whose businesses Graham had muscled into, former associates who had lost fortunes at his hands. But when these figures were brought in, witnesses refused to testify. Threats were delivered quietly, but effectively. To speak against Newcastle's Hardman was to sign one's own death warrant. Despite the lack of charges, the raids did unsettle the criminal landscape. With Graham gone, the delicate balance of power collapsed. Smaller crews tried to muscle in on lucrative doors, sparking violent clashes outside clubs. Police patrols increased, and plainclothes officers haunted the nightlife. But it was like trying to cage a storm. For detectives, the frustration was personal. They had spent years watching Graham, building cases against him that never quite stuck. Now that he was dead, their chance at justice slipped through their fingers again. Instead of delivering closure, their raids only exposed how deep the culture of fear ran in Newcastle. No one was ever convicted for the murder of Viv Graham. Every arrest ended in release. Every operation fizzled out. The hitman, or the men who ordered him, vanished into the shadows, protected by silence. And with each passing year, the case slipped further into the realm of myth, leaving behind only scars, suspicions, and the uneasy knowledge that justice had never been served. When it came to the murder of Viv Graham, the courtroom never became the stage for a final reckoning. Despite the flurry of raids, interrogations, and whispered accusations, no single suspect was ever brought to trial for pulling the trigger that New Year's Eve. Yet, the years that followed saw several figures connected to Newcastle's door wars stand before judges, not for Viv's killing, but for the spiral of violence and crime that his absence unleashed. Inquests into Graham's death revealed little more than the brutality of the act. 3 bullets fired at close range, the cold precision of an ambush, and the chaos of a city that had watched its most infamous Hardman fall. But the identity of his killer remained sealed behind a wall of silence. Witnesses who might have offered crucial testimony either disappeared, recanted, or claimed they didn't see a thing. The message was clear. In Newcastle's underworld, talking meant dying. What the courts did see, however, was the aftermath. Rival gangs, emboldened by Graham's assassination, clashed violently in the mid-1990s. Prosecutors pursued cases against enforcers caught with weapons, dealers tied to the clubs, and foot soldiers who tried to seize Graham's former empire. Some received long prison sentences for drug trafficking, extortion, and assaults, but none of these trials answered the central question: who ordered and who executed it? The hit on Viv Graham? For the public, the absence of justice was maddening. Newspapers kept the story alive, painting Graham as both victim and villain, a man who lived by the sword and died by it, yet whose killers walked free. Families of victims in other gangland disputes voiced frustration too, arguing that Graham's case symbolized the wider failure to crack Newcastle's criminal code of silence. By the close of the decade, the courts had punished many in the city's underworld, but the murder that had triggered the upheaval remained unsolved. In legal terms, Viv Graham's file was still open. In cultural terms, it had already become legend. Viv Graham's assassination remains one of Tyneside's darkest legends. More than 3 decades later, his name still stirs conversation in Newcastle pubs, his story retold with a mix of awe and unease. To some, he was the man who kept order in a volatile nightlife, a figure who imposed discipline through fear. To others, he was simply a violent enforcer whose life ended exactly as it was lived, at the mercy of a gun. The unsolved nature of his murder leaves a lingering unease. Unlike other high-profile gangland killings, no convictions ever followed. No trial revealed hidden truths. Instead, the city was left with questions. Who wanted Viv gone badly enough to strike on New Year's Eve? In public, with such brazen finality, was it a rival crew tired of paying him? A betrayed associate settling a score? Or was his death the inevitable conclusion to a career built on intimidation and enemies? For Newcastle, Graham's death marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The door wars of the 1990s escalated in his absence, and the city's nightlife became a battlefield for new contenders. Yet, the myth of Viv endured. His photograph still surfaces in documentaries and true crime accounts, frozen in time as the Hardman who could not escape his fate. And so, the question remains, echoing across Tyneside. Did justice fail Viv Graham, or was justice simply carried out in the only way the underworld knows?